As the early 1910s progressed, the Italian Navy found itself facing both an escalating arms race with the Austro-Hungarian Navy, as well as having to look at overseas developments. Whilst in previous dreadnoughts they'd just gone for more 12-inch guns, the simple fact was that by early 1913 the British had built super dreadnoughts with 13.5-inch guns, and were in the middle of building ships armed with 15-inch weapons. The Germans were in the process of finalising the design of their own 15-inch ships. The Americans had two classes of 14-inch ships under construction and were about to lay down a third that had only one less 14-inch gun than the Italian latest designs had 12-inch guns. And even the French, who were lagging a little bit behind the curve, were about to launch the hulls of their 13.4-inch armed ships. And so, Rear Admiral Ferranti drew up a design that would be a serious step change for Italian capital ships. Initially, he wanted to match the American gun numbers and British gun size while still retaining the Italian flair for speed. But this proved impractical, so he settled down on a still impressive vessel that emerged with a main armament of 8 15-inch guns in 4 twin turrets, mounted in super-firing pairs fore and aft, with a secondary battery of a dozen 6-inch guns in casemates, but ones that would be mounted as high in the hull as humanly possible on an upper deck that served as a platform for the upper main guns and the superstructure. A heavy battery of 8 underwater torpedo tubes is suggested by some sources, whilst an unusually heavy anti-aircraft battery of 8 single 4-inch and a dozen 40mm is suggested by others. The main gun turrets were also unusually widely spaced apart, ostensibly to reduce the risk of a hit to one disabling both turrets. Speed was to be an impressive 28 knots, courtesy of 105,000 shaft horsepower, which seemed to suggest that it was perhaps the first true fast battleship. But fitting all these impressive features on a hull that displaced around 31,000 tons at normal load came with a cost, and that cost was protection. Whilst the near 16-inch thick turret faces were quite heavily protected, the main belt had to be a hair under 12 inches thick, with only 2 inches allocated for the deck, although the ship was liberally covered with other thinner plates as well, since it followed the distributed armour layout. Minimal torpedo defence systems were also included. Interestingly, given that another class of high-speed ships with around 12 inches of armour and 8 15-inch guns were shortly to be considered in the UK, the Italian vessels were to be named after famous admirals, and with apologies to any Italian listeners, the 4 ships would be named the Francesco Caraciolo, Cristoforo Colombo, Marcantonio Colonna, and Francesco Morosini. Thus, they are commonly known as the Caracciolo class, but could perhaps be considered the Admiral class as well. The lead ship was laid down in October 1914, with the other 3 following in the first half of 1915, but the need to build up the rest of the fleet and then the Italian entry into World War I meant that steel was prioritised for other, faster-to-finish ships, and only the hull of the Caracciolo was in any way substantially built up when work was ordered stopped in 1916. Revisions to the design's deck armour were made in the latter part of the war as the lessons of combat further north were taken in, but the 15-inch guns built for the ships found themselves instead diverted to a series of monitors, coastal defence emplacements, and railguns. With the end of the war, work restarted on the Caracciolo, the only one still substantially left as the materials of the other 3 had largely been reused during the war in other places. Various ideas were floated, as to say Italy's economic situation was dire is an understatement akin to claiming HMS Indefatigable's experience at Jutland had perhaps been a little less than ideal. These ideas included completing the ship as a one-off, converting the hull into an aircraft carrier, a cheaper conversion to a floatplane carrier, and even selling the hull off to turn it into an ocean liner. She was actually launched and sold off for the latter purpose, the idea being to turn her into a larger combined passenger cargo ship of the type often found on long-distance trade routes, but the hull was soon returned as the new owners realised the cost of doing this was far too high. With the Washington Naval Treaty coming into play, the hull was placed in reserve whilst further arguments were made over whether to revisit the aircraft carrier idea, but with further budget restrictions, the ship was sent to the breakers in 1926.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.